In this video, Jordan Peterson and Andrew Huberman talk about the dangers of porn and masturbation. They start by giving an overview of the brain's dopamine system.
You know, one thing about the dopamine system that's so important and also explains a lot of pathology, but also a lot of human evolution, is that we have basically one major reward system, which is the dopaminergic system. You know, I sometimes like the analogy that, you know, nowadays you hear about cryptocurrency or the dollar versus the euro versus the this versus the that. There's only one currency in all of reality, actually, and it's dopamine. Whether or not it's the dollar-backed dopamine or it's euro-backed dopamine or Bitcoin-backed dopamine. In the end, whether or not someone has $1 billion or $2 is really that currency resides as something that's transacted in the real world, but their notion of power and potential is dopaminergic. And so too, the potential for mates, the potential for food, how much food you have, you know, how much meat you have stored in the freezer tells you a lot about your security and well-being for you and your family, right? And that is translated into a dopaminergic internal representation of how safe and secure you are, etc. The dopaminergic system that we're talking about, anticipation and then action and reward, or in some cases, no reward, right? And the ability to persist toward a goal regardless, is a generalizable system. You had that chapter about, get your room in order, right? Get your belongings in order. This is, I think, very relevant right now. Even though it's important to have higher goals and lofty goals, the dopamine system is an incredible system because it is depletable, and yet it's also renewable, and it is self-amplifying. What I mean by that is, let's say that I'm somebody who doesn't know what I'm working toward. I don't have a specific goal or question. By completing even what seem like menial tasks, like making myself a cup of coffee, drinking it, cleaning up completely, drying the cup and putting it back in the cupboard, what happens is, even if you make that seemingly trivial goal the goal, in addition to making the kitchen look nicer, it completes a circuit. It closes the dopaminergic circuit. And when dopamine is released, and it will be, maybe not to the same extent as publishing a novel, but to some extent, dopamine amplifies our ability to think into the future, to make additional plans that are unrelated to what you just did. And it literally increases confidence and energy. Why? Well, for the following reason. We all think about caloric energy, but what most people are never taught, and if I had 10 things I could teach people, one of them would be adrenaline, epinephrine, is neural energy. It's your ability to get up and go. It's the thing that makes you jittery when you're a little nervous, but it's also what allows you to move forward, to go out for a run, to pursue any goal, cognitive or physical, etc. Epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, those are the same thing, is literally manufactured from the molecule dopamine. If you look at the biochemical cascade, dopamine is converted into adrenaline, which is the basis of all energy, all neural energy. Right. And so, including thinking. And so if one is not in a place of being able to set their goal on a particular lofty goal, a graduate degree, a book, etc., yet the way one gets to that is by completing things in their immediate environment from start to finish and closing the dopaminergic loop. You literally...
Yeah, well, those are at least micro narratives.
That's right.
Right, so they're not integrated across a long span of time, but they're not nothing. And so one of the things, I did write about this in my first book, particularly about putting your house in perfect order. It's like, well, if you're lost, one of the things you can do is look around and see what direction you could take locally, is fix something. And I used to tell my clients, this is a very good thing to know. Find something that you could do that would make things better that you would do. And there's a humility in that too, because especially if you're in a low energy state, it's like, oh my God, I don't have enough energy to make dinner. It's like, do you have enough energy to put a fork on the table? And sometimes people are so depressed that that's really all they can do. It's like, can you take a small step forward, no matter how small that is? Basically what you're saying is that if you implement a micro routine, even something like washing a cup and putting it back in the shelf, and that's a good thing because you have a shelf and there's cups on it, you've already decided that's an appropriate way to live, is to have your coffee cups on a shelf. If you go ahead with cleaning out the cup and putting it on the shelf, then you've taken steps towards a valuable micro goal. You get a dopamine kick from that, that transforms itself into adrenaline and energizes you.
Which then,
So that's partly the reason that it has an antidepressant effect.
that's right. And then you can lean into another behavior. A few years back when I started doing some public-facing education, I started getting a lot of questions, especially on YouTube, from young males about pornography and masturbation. And this becomes very relevant here. We have to remember that this dopaminergic system is generalizable to many different behaviors, right? Academic pursuits, sports pursuits, relationship pursuits. One of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort or any pursuit that's directed. So for instance, cocaine, a drug which potently increases dopamine, but doesn't require any sort of adaptive action pursuit except to acquire the drug and spend money on it. No sacrifice. So what ends up happening is the circuit that gets rewarded is only the drug-seeking behavior, and no other behavior will give the kind of potent dopamine release that cocaine or methamphetamine will, which is why they are so pernicious.
Plus, they have that powerful reinforcing effect, right? So not only do you get that kick, but what's reinforced by the dopamine release is the behaviors that were right prior to the ingestion. And if all that is the drug-taking behavior, that's all that develops.
That's right.
You build that monster inside your head.
That's right.
So I can see where you're going on the pornography front.
Right. So I was starting to get a lot of questions. I was kind of surprised. I thought, well, I'm male and, maybe that's why they feel comfortable asking. But people were saying, were asking about pornography, and they were asking, I'll just be direct about it, they were asking whether or not masturbation was bad. They were asking whether or not masturbation with ejaculation was particularly bad. And here's my stance on this. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist, not a psychologist. But what we know for sure is that if an individual repeatedly engages in this circuitry, let's say masturbation and pornography with increasingly potent forms of stimulation that are on a screen, a couple of things happen. First of all, what's being reinforced? What's being reinforced is a high dopaminergic response to watching other people engage in sexual behavior, which is very different than being in a first-person sexual experience, okay? So right there, that what's being reinforced is not actually any kind of improvement in communication skills. It's voyeurism. And as these questions started to come in more and more, I started to realize there was a lot of kind of undertones of people talking about fear of or experience with sexual dysfunction that clearly pornography can lead to. And here I'm specifically talking about males. I actually don't know the literature on females. So here I'm talking about...
Females don't use visual pornography to the same degree.
I see.
They use literary pornography.
I see. So... So, and then you start to think about, okay, what happens in the cascade or the arc of sexual arousal and orgasm? What happens is that initially there's it's parasympathetically dominant, meaning if somebody is too stressed, they actually can't engage in sexual behavior. The arousal response doesn't occur. Erection is blunted, but the actual orgasm response and ejaculation is strongly associated with the so-called sympathetic nervous system, which has nothing to do with sympathy. It has everything to do with, it's a kind of a stress response. And then it reverses to a parasympathetic response. And a hormone called prolactin increases dramatically after ejaculation in males. What does that do? That blunts dopamine release and testosterone for a very long period of time, which makes sense if pair bonding and sort of, in our species anywhere, there's this idea that then other molecules would be exchanged with partners, pair bonding, potential for raising mates, etc. Without getting into a huge discussion about that, the point is this. Masturbation and pornography are potently tapping into the dopamine system and can undermine the very processes of which I consider healthy processes of finding a mate, dating, communication, eventually, if it's appropriate, sexual interaction, etc.
It's undermining pair bonding.
I don't think we need to be entirely afraid of pursuing or engaging in things that release dopamine. Obviously, healthy sexual behavior, food that we love, social engagement, all of these things can be dopaminergic. It's the big peaks in dopamine that are not associated with any prior effort or organization of self that are particularly dangerous for the human being.